There are moments in history when the world does not slowly change. It shatters, not with a warning, not with a countdown, but with a single blinding instant. At 3:17 a.m. Central European Time, a silent flash erupted over Eastern Europe, bright enough to be seen from space. For half a second, the night turned into day. And in that moment, everything humanity believed about war, power, and restraint collapsed. Because a nuclear weapon had just been used, not in a test, not in a threat, but in combat. This is the story of the first 6 hours after Russia crossed the nuclear line, and how NATO answered. The detonation. At first, the sensors did not understand what they were seeing. Thermal satellites registered a sudden, impossible spike in temperature. Radiation monitors flared red. Seismic stations recorded a shock wave that did not match any earthquake pattern. Within seconds, analysts realized the truth. A nuclear explosion, not strategic, not city-destroying, but tactical. A low-yield nuclear weapon detonated near a key military staging area close to the front lines. The fireball consumed everything within seconds. Vehicles vaporized. Concrete crumbled like ash. The air itself ignited. A mushroom cloud rose into the night sky, twisting slowly as radioactive debris spiraled upward, carried by winds that would soon spread invisible death far beyond the blast zone. And then came the silence. Not peace, not calm, but the silence that follows something so violent, the world itself seems stunned. In underground bunkers across Europe and North America, red lights flickered on. Nuclear detonation confirmed. For the first time since 1945, the nuclear taboo was broken. The first calls. 15 minutes after the blast, emergency lines ignited across the globe. Presidents were pulled from their beds. Prime ministers interrupted mid-sleep. Defense ministers awakened by aides whose faces carried a fear they had never shown before. Inside NATO headquarters in Brussels, security protocols escalated instantly. The building entered wartime mode. No press, no visitors, no civilian movement, only military command. Giant screens displayed satellite imagery, radiation dispersion models, and airspace maps. There were no speeches, no dramatic pauses, only one sentence repeated again and again. This is real. The alliance awakes. Within 30 minutes, NATO forces across Europe began mobilizing, not for attack, but for survival. Fighter jets rolled from hardened shelters. Bomber squadrons were repositioned. Airborne early warning aircraft lifted into the skies, forming invisible shields of radar and communication. Naval task forces already at sea received encrypted messages, not orders to strike, not yet, but orders to prepare. Because now, everything was measured in minutes. Across Europe, airspace was quietly cleared, civilian flights diverted or grounded, airports closed without explanation. The public would not be told yet, but militaries already knew. The world had entered a different phase of existence. The world learns. As information leaked, panic spread faster than any missile ever could. On social media, blurry satellite images appeared, then amateur videos, then official confirmation. A nuclear weapon had been used. In cities across Europe, traffic slowed to a crawl. Shops were emptied within minutes. Families gathered in silence around glowing screens. Markets collapsed. Energy prices exploded upward. Currencies trembled. Insurance companies froze operations. But none of that mattered inside military command centers. Because the real question was not what had happened, but what would happen next. Would Russia strike again? Or was this a signal, a warning written in fire? The dilemma. NATO now faced a decision that had haunted Cold War planners for decades. Respond too weakly, and nuclear weapons become acceptable. Respond too strongly, and humanity disappears. This was not about revenge. It was about precedent. If a nuclear strike went unanswered, every future war would carry the shadow of atomic fire. Yet a nuclear response risked ending everything. So, NATO searched for a third path, one that punished, one that deterred, but one that did not ignite the apocalypse. Article 5 without words. Officially, Article 5, NATO's collective defense clause, had not yet been invoked, but in practice, it already was. Joint command structures activated across the alliance. National boundaries dissolved into a single operational map. The United States assumed strategic coordination. Europe provided geographic leverage. Every allied nation became part of a single war machine, not aimed at cities, not aimed at civilians, but aimed directly at Russia's ability to repeat what it had just done. This would be punishment through limitation, not annihilation. The first shadow strike. The retaliation began without explosions. Across Western Russia and occupied territories, military networks began to fail. Radar systems blinked offline. Encrypted channels froze. Command servers crashed. Cyber warfare, silent, invisible, crippled Russia's ability to coordinate its forces, not permanently, not totally, but long enough to matter. Then came the electronic warfare. Aircraft flying beyond Russian airspace began flooding sensors with false signals. Missile batteries saw ghosts. Radar operators tracked objects that did not exist. The sky became a maze of illusions. This was NATO's first strike, and no one on the ground could even see it. The sky ignites. Then the physical retaliation began. Cruise missiles launched from aircraft, submarines, and naval platforms streaked across the darkness. Their targets were not cities. They were air defense systems, missile transport routes, command bunkers, fuel depots, communications hubs. Each target selected to reduce Russia's ability to launch another nuclear weapon. Explosions rippled across strategic military locations, not random, not indiscriminate, surgical, calculated, relentless. Across Europe, fighter jets roared into contested airspace, protected by electronic warfare aircraft that blinded enemy sensors. For the first time since the Cold War, two nuclear-armed alliances were directly striking each other, and still, no second nuclear weapon had been launched. Yet, Russia answers. Russia did not remain silent. Air defenses lit up the skies, missiles streaked upward, interceptors clashed with incoming weapons. But Russia's response came not with nuclear fire, but conventional fury. Long-range cruise missiles launched from bombers and warships surged toward NATO positions in Eastern Europe. Military bases were struck. Supply corridors shattered. Logistics hubs burned. Across Poland, Romania, and the Baltics, explosions echoed through the night. This was no longer a regional conflict. It was now a full-scale war between alliances. And beneath it all, the nuclear forces of both sides remained alert. Armed, ready, waiting. The edge of misunderstanding. Now the war entered its most dangerous phase, not because of missiles, but because of uncertainty. Every radar signal was scrutinized, every aircraft tracked, every satellite movement interpreted through the lens of nuclear fear. A conventional missile could be mistaken for a nuclear one. A radar glitch could trigger retaliation. A misinterpreted signal could end civilization. Inside command centers, officers stared at screens without blinking, because now the smallest mistake carried the weight of extinction. The pause before the fall. 6 hours after the nuclear detonation, the world still existed, but it was no longer the same world. NATO had struck back, Russia had responded, but nuclear weapons had not been used again. Not yet. And that was the most terrifying part of all, because now both sides face the same question. Do we stop here? Or do we escalate into a future no one survives? Cities across the globe waited in silence, because now humanity understood something terrifyingly simple. The future no longer belonged to people. It belonged to decisions. And those decisions were being made behind sealed doors, by people who knew there were no winners left, only survivors. 6 hours after the nuclear detonation, the world had not ended, and that was almost worse. Because now, humanity existed in a fragile, trembling space between survival and annihilation. Across Europe, sirens wailed in major cities. Governments issued emergency broadcasts that said everything and nothing. Remain calm. Stay indoors. Further instructions to follow. But calm was impossible now. People stared at their phones in disbelief, refreshing news feeds that changed by the minute. Airports were closed, borders sealed, markets frozen. Nuclear shelters reopened for the first time in generations. This was no longer history. This was the present, and the present was on the brink of collapse. The invisible war, command versus chaos. While missiles struck and jets screamed through the sky, the true battle unfolded far from any battlefield. It was happening inside rooms with no windows, inside bunkers buried beneath mountains, inside steel-reinforced command centers deep underground, inside digital networks where unseen signals determined the fate of continents. Because now, the war was no longer about firepower. It was about control. Could either side still command their forces? Could they stop what they had already started? Or had the war taken on a momentum of its own? NATO commanders feared something worse than a second nuclear strike, a nuclear accident. A missile launched without orders, a system malfunction misread as an attack, a commander panicking at the wrong moment. This is how civilizations die, not always by intent, but by error. The warning that shook the war room. At 6.5 hours, a classified message arrived inside NATO's Central Command. It was brief, encrypted, terrifying. Russian strategic forces had shifted posture, not to launch, but to disperse. Mobile missile units were leaving bases. Submarines were changing depth and position. Aircraft capable of carrying nuclear weapons were relocating. This did not mean Russia was about to fire, but it meant they were preparing for the possibility, which meant NATO now faced a terrible reality. If they continued striking Russian military infrastructure too aggressively, they might trigger exactly what they were trying to prevent. So, NATO slowed, not stopped, slowed. Target selection became narrower. Strike authorization required multiple levels of approval. Every missile launch was debated, because now every action carried nuclear consequences. The first diplomatic whispers. Then something extraordinary happened. Behind closed doors, through secure lines that had not been used for years. Diplomacy re-emerged from the shadows. The United States contacted Russia through emergency Cold War-era channels. So did France. So did Germany. The messages were not threats. They were not ultimatums. They were warnings. Do not escalate. We will not strike civilian targets. This can still be contained. Russia's replies were cold, sparse, but not silent. That alone mattered, because silence in war is the most dangerous language of all. The human side of the war. While generals debated trajectories and thresholds, millions of civilians lived through the first hours of World War III without understanding any of it. In Eastern Europe, families slept in bathtubs and basements. In Western Europe, people queued for fuel and food in silence. In America, citizens gathered around televisions that showed maps instead of faces. Children asked questions no parent could answer. Is the war here? Will the bomb come here? Are we safe? And for the first time in decades, no one could say yes. The most dangerous moment of any war is not the beginning. It is when both sides believe they are losing control. At hour 8, that moment arrived. NATO intelligence detected movement near one of Russia's early warning radar installations, a facility critical to detecting incoming nuclear missiles. A NATO strike package was already inbound toward nearby military infrastructure. If that radar went offline, Russia could interpret it as an attempt to blind them before a nuclear first strike, which could trigger an immediate launch. Inside NATO command, officers froze. The strike was aborted. Missiles already in the air were redirected mid-flight. Aircraft pulled away. And in that instant, Humanity came within minutes of its extinction, not from aggression, but from misunderstanding. The war stabilizes. After 9 hours, something unexpected occurred. The war slowed, not stopped, not resolved, but stabilized. Major strike operations were suspended. Air activity reduced. Cyber operations continued, but without further physical escalation. It was not peace. It was a fragile equilibrium born from fear. Both sides now understood. If either escalated again with nuclear weapons, there would be no containment, no negotiation, no future. So, the war entered a new phase, a phase of restraint. Not because of mercy, but because of survival. The nuclear shadow. Yet, even as missiles stopped flying, the shadow of nuclear war did not fade. Radiation from the original detonation spread across parts of Eastern Europe. Contaminated zones were evacuated, livestock destroyed, water sources sealed. The invisible aftermath began. Cancers would rise. Birth defects would appear years later. Entire regions would become uninhabitable, and all from a single weapon. Not hundreds, not thousands, just one. A terrifying reminder of how thin the barrier truly is between civilization and extinction. Yea, what NATO achieved, and what it lost. By striking back, NATO achieved its immediate objective. Russia did not use a second nuclear weapon, but the cost was enormous. Thousands of conventional casualties, military infrastructure destroyed, airspace transformed into battlefields. Trust between nuclear powers shattered. The world learned a new lesson. Nuclear war does not begin with cities vanishing. It begins with one limited strike, followed by a race to stop the unstoppable. The war that did not end after the first 6 hours. The war did not end. It transformed. It became slower, colder, more cautious, but far more dangerous. Because now, nuclear weapons were no longer theoretical. They were real. They were used. And once a weapon is used, it is never truly unused again. Every future conflict would carry their shadow. Every decision weighed against that moment. 3:17 a.m., the time humanity crossed a line it can never uncross. A world changed forever. World War III did not end civilization in 6 hours, but it ended something just as important, the belief that nuclear war was unthinkable. Now the world knew better. Now humanity understood that the end does not come with a warning. It comes quietly, with a flash in the night, and the sound of a world holding its breath, because survival is no longer guaranteed. It is negotiated, minute by minute, decision by decision, on the edge of oblivion.